Good morning. My name is Andy Milson. This is my colleague Charlie Travis, and we are geographers in the history department. And so we are going to essentially talk about how you can integrate geography, maps, and so forth into your history teaching, or perhaps integrate history into your geography teaching, whichever your assignment happens to be. How many of you are history teachers primarily? Anybody a geography teacher? Okay, great. So a little bit of both. So we're going to start out with an activity that I think you might be able to use, perhaps modify a little bit for your particular classroom situation. I posted 5 copies of this map around the room in the back. It's all the same map. So what I'd like for us to do to start out is for about 4 to 5 people to go to each map. And what I want you to imagine you're doing is that you need to explain this map to somebody over the phone who can't see it. Okay, so I want you to really attend to all the detail of that map, study it, and be able to describe what you see in that map. What are the features of it? What things do you notice? And be able to describe that to somebody over the phone who is not able to see it. So we'll start out doing that. We'll come back, we'll talk about that a little bit. I'll give you some of the history behind this map, and then we'll pose the perhaps intriguing question, what if Abraham Lincoln had access to G.I.S, geospatial technologies? What if the president could have used at that point in time some of the resources that we have available to us today? So let's go ahead and start off with, you can just sort of break yourselves into, I think probably 4 or 5 per map. There's 4 of them across the back wall, and there's 1 around the corner. You sort of separate yourselves out. Do this for about 5 or 8 minutes. Okay, let's go ahead and come back together. Okay, so we're going to pretend we're talking to somebody on the phone, and we need to describe this map to them. Somebody get us started. What's the first thing you might say? Yes?
I would say that along the Mississippi and other rivers, you'll have a larger amount of enslaved populations, because that's where a lot of cotton and sugar production is.
Okay, so we see a pattern. So you're talking to me on the phone. I don't even know what I'm looking at. What is this map that you're describing to me? What's it showing?
Comparing the free population to the comparing where you see more slaves. It also shows the free population compared to the slave population.
Slave population. Okay, in the southern states. So it's a map of the southern part of the United States. How is it divided up? By counties. Okay, so they're counties. And so there's a free population and a slave population. How do I see that on the map?
That is compiled from the 1860 census.
It's from the 1860 census.
By the colors.
Okay, so it's a colored map.
Well, there's a layer shaded.
Shaded. All right. Percentage of the slave population
The darker
is
the color,
free.
the higher the slave population.
All right, so the darker spots on the map have
Higher percentage.
higher percentage of slaves.
Something we read was just remember on the right is that the lighter shades are where the free blacks and whites lived.
All right, so we see lighter counties and darker counties. And then we get to this idea of, okay, along rivers, maybe, what's the pattern then?
There's a lot more slaves.
More slaves, darker counties. What else can we observe about the map?
Further up north you go, the lighter the shade, which lets the enslaved population have at least a higher free population.
So there's an uneven geography of slavery around the South?
Yes. And I said New Orleans was a free area.
So we don't have slave states where there's slaves all over the place, right? Same amount of slaves everywhere.
No.
We've got concentrations of slaves in some places in the South and not in others. Oh, okay. What's the title of the map?
Wounded souls.
Slave population,
Map of the slave population of the southern states of the United States. All right. Census of 1860. All right, so I know my data is coming from the 1860 census.
But it was created after secession in 1861, so this is a division line.
1861 secession. All right, so this is a map. Is this a map of all the states that seceded from the Union?
No.
No. All right, just the map, just the states that had slavery officially.
You might consider all the states that they suspected might have people sympathetic
to the Confederate cause. Why wasn't the map titled Map of the Confederate States of the United States? Yes, it's the person who made the map chose what to call it, right? They're not going to say the Confederate States. That would lend legitimacy,
Right.
yes, to the Confederacy. So we're going to call this a map of the southern states, right, of the United States, the slave states. What else did you notice on the map? What else is there that, so I'm getting a sense now that you're telling me about this on the phone of what this looks like. What other things are on the map? Yes, ma'am.
I thought it was interesting, some of the little pockets that pop up every so often where you have like a heavy slave population and all of a sudden you don't have a slave population, and then it leads into, again, where you have the heavy slave population. It's like, what happened?
Yeah.
like in Georgia.
In Georgia.
Well, we noticed it was when it was close to water, they tended to be higher.
Yes, federal land. Federal land.
Yeah.
Federal good crops.
Along the Gulf or along the river transportation.
So this starts to make us want to ask some historical questions, right? What's going on here? Why is there an uneven distribution of slavery in the South, perhaps? That's one question we can look at. What was going on? Some people have made a hypothesis that, well, along rivers, you had counties with larger slave populations and so forth. What else is on the map that you noticed?
Well, you can gain a sense of like where there's major agricultural centers or centers of high agricultural output. So I mean, especially since this is a map that's brought out in 1861, it would definitely provide you a good sense of strategic importance.
Yeah.
The whole Mississippi campaign.
Right. So if I'm using this for a military purpose, maybe I can read this map in a particular way. Or if I had some other data sources, like what are the crops being grown in this particular area, and so forth. What else is on the map?
It kind of suggests to me in the East some areas that have become less productive over time that now therefore have fewer slaves.
Yeah. All right.
There's actually a ledger down there that actually tells the actual population
Okay.
of slave and free, right in the middle, right down in the Gulf area.
Yeah.
There's a table.
Oh, right here.
Yeah, and actually have the numbers. So if I was on the census, Abraham Lincoln thinking about, the population that's there, those slave numbers are very high.
Right.
So it could have been what he was looking at when he decided to write the emancipation. I can take away their power and the powers.
Do you notice anything about the order in which the states were listed?
From the secession.
Yes. It's not a perfect list, but the first one is South Carolina, and I think Mississippi is second or something like that. So, kind of interesting. The map maker chose not to list this in order of alphabetical order or something like that. It's by the concentration of slaves, but interesting that almost parallels the order in which those states seceded from the Union. What's the banner there across the top, right here?
Sick and wounded soldiers.
U.S. Army.
Sold for the benefit of the sick and wounded soldiers of the U.S. Army. So what does that tell us about maybe one of the purposes for this map? So people would buy this map, put it up in their house. Artwork, I guess. Why might people be interested in buying that?
Well, as the war grinds on, it becomes more of a moralistic war for the North. They're fighting not just to keep the Union together, but they're also fighting to free African Americans.
So this gives you a sense from a military perspective of the locations where perhaps there's greater concentrations of slaves. That might tell us more about the places where there need to be campaigns, or where there might be stronger secessionist sentiment, perhaps. So there's all kinds of inferences we might make about that.
Does it say who produced this map? I didn't
Yeah, so I put that on here. It was produced by the Coastal Survey. I'll explain more about the history of it here in just a second. So, yeah.
It's interesting to note that other than the fact that you have Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, and also the importance of the Mississippi River, a lot of battles take place in areas where there's really high slave populations, especially the Mississippi campaign and the Virginia campaign.
Yeah. So you can see maybe there's some strategic use for this map.
Well, they would use slaves as marshals.
Right. And so let's take a look at this image here. Anybody seen this before? Recognize it? So this is called the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation of President Lincoln, and it's a portrait that was painted by Francis Bicknell Carpenter in 1864. So it's a contemporary image. Anybody know, obviously you recognize Abraham Lincoln, but anybody know who else those other people are in that image?
Secretary of War Seward, I think I see, I'm not sure if that's even Wisconsin in the background. I'm trying to think, who's there? All I recognize is Stewart.
So who are these people? We've got Secretary of War. That's actually the Secretary of Treasury, Sam Chase. It's his cabinet, right? So you've got standing over here to the, which direction is that? Left, no, right, stage left, right of Lincoln. That's the Secretary of the Treasury, Sam Chase. Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, is seated kind of behind Lincoln with his arm. The guy in the foreground with his arms crossed is Secretary of State, William Seward. The guy to Lincoln's left with the beard is the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. The guy that's standing in the left to the rear is Caleb B. Smith. You've got the Postmaster Montgomery Blair, and seated at the far right is the Attorney General Edwin Bates. And so this is called the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. So the idea is that the piece of paper there that Lincoln has in his hands is the, Emancipation Proclamation. He's discussing it with his cabinet. Anybody have any guesses about why he arranged? Now, he wasn't actually there when this happened, but he did talk to the people and he met with Lincoln and so forth. Anybody ideas why he arranged the people, the characters, the way he did?
I just noticed that map on
There you go. Yeah, that's
the one.
I was waiting for somebody to pick that out. Yeah. So check this
There's
out.
actually like two copies of it.
You see that? That's the map we were just looking at. Right? So it's down here on the floor. This is actually a different map. That's a map of the slave population of Virginia. You've got an atlas down here on the floor. This over here is you can't see it very well, but it's a New York Daily News or something, an abolitionist newspaper. And so he staged some of the things, and he's put that in there sort of to show the kind of information that the cabinet might have been using.
I know it's not very important, but you know who the portrait is?
There is a portrait of Jackson. That might be Jackson. There was I don't know actually.
I think the way they're all lined out, you've got Secretary of War, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of the Navy, and also the Secretary of State. All four of those guys are the most critical and most crucial guys you need for a war. Treasury because of money, and then your military cabinet members, and then the other three, Attorney General. I mean, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus.
Yeah.
And then the other two, they aren't exactly as important in terms of warfare. So they're kind of further out away from Lincoln, while the other four are much closer to him.
Right. And if you've seen Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, this is the cover of that book. And unfortunately, they cropped it, so you lose the map on the cover of her book. But when you look at the full image, you get the map there as well. So Team of Rivals Did he pick a bunch of yes men for his cabinet?
No.
No, he picked people who might, yeah, and give him conflicting opinions and so forth. Carpenter chose to arrange the cabinet by the way in which they supported or opposed the Emancipation Proclamation. So the people standing closest to him were the people who supported his Emancipation Proclamation. You've got Salmon Chase, literally standing behind him, in support, and then the guys across the table crossing their arms, like, I don't know about this Emancipation Proclamation thing. All right, so let's go back to the map. Let me tell you a little bit about the history of this map. So, as you guys saw, this is the map of the slave population of the southern states from 1861. The original was about 27 inches by 33 inches, so pretty close to the size of the maps that we have up here on the wall. So you can imagine the original, and that's depicted there in that portrait of the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. This was the first American map to illustrate the population density of slavery. So imagine how long slavery had been around, how long the census had been going on. They collected information about slaves in the censuses, but this was the first attempt to sort of make a map showing exactly where the slave population was. And this was a period in the history of cartography where there was a lot of excitement about the scientific approaches to map making, to doing statistical cartography. And you may have noticed the gentleman who is the cartographer, Edwin Hergensheimer. Any guesses where Hergensheimer was from? Germany, yes. So after the revolutions of 1848, a lot of German scientists and map makers came to the United States, lent their expertise in statistical cartography. And so maps before this had all kinds of illustrations and cartouches and images, and were intended to be kind of florid artwork, many of them. Mid-19th century, you get into this kind of transition where the idea is let the data speak for themselves, show the statistics. So this map was intended to sort of translate all of that vast data from the census into something that was a compelling, sort of comprehensive image where you could look at it and go, okay, that's where the slaves are. I can see by looking at that where the concentrations are. And I also quickly understand the geography of slavery is uneven. It's not everywhere. There aren't really slave states. More accurately, we could say there were slave counties. And there were concentrations throughout particular valleys. So this is a turning point. Carpenter wanted to very carefully reproduce this map in the portrait because he knew of its importance. He knew that this was an important map. He spent about 6 months in the White House to produce this painting, so he actually had insider access to Lincoln. And he says in his memoirs that he found Lincoln studying this map more than once. That Lincoln regularly pored over that particular map. So I think that kind of makes the map come alive a little bit more than just, here's an old map, but here's a map that Lincoln used to study carefully. When we're teaching history, we can show them a map and say, you know what, not only is this map old, this is a map that the president had at his side, and he looked at this regularly. And he used that map to make decisions about the war. So Carpenter thought the Emancipation Proclamation was a scene second only in historical importance to the Declaration of Independence. So he thought this is something that needs to be memorialized in a very important portrait. He wanted to capture the reality of the moment when the proclamation was read in 1862. So this is before he actually delivered it publicly. So as I said, he arranged the cabinet in the order of their response to emancipation, from those who were most in favor of it to those who were least in favor of it. And he intentionally put Lincoln kind of at the center as sort of the uniting force. The light is also kind of, there's a little bit of an aura around him. The idea is that Lincoln is sort of the uniting force, bringing the cabinet, bringing the rivals together, bringing all the factions together, and also kind of translating the war into a moral cause. So Carpenter actually says in his memoir that he took, here's a photo of Carpenter. He took that map, Lincoln's copy of the map. Imagine that today, just go and go, hey, the president uses this. I'm going to take this over to my studio for a little while. So he took the map with him to his studio so that he could reproduce it in his portrait. And he says, you know, wishing to introduce this map into my picture, I carried it off one day without the president's knowledge. And as the copying of it was a tedious affair, it remained in the studio for some time. This chanced to be during the week of Kilpatrick's great cavalry raid in Virginia. One afternoon, the president came in alone, as was his wont, the observation of the daily progress of the picture appearing to afford him a species of recreation. The idea is that Lincoln needed to take a break every now and then, so he went over and visited Carpenter, like, oh, so how's that portrait coming along? What are you working on? So presently his eye fell upon the map, leaning against a chair as I had left it after making a study. Ah, said he, you have appropriated my map, have you? I've been looking around. I've been looking all around for it. So, you know, the president's like, hey, where'd my map go? I need that. I've been studying that. And with that, he put on his spectacles, taking it up, walking to the window, sitting down upon the trunk, began to pore over it very earnestly. He pointed out Kilpatrick's position when last heard from and said, it is just as I thought it was. He is close upon Blank County, where the slaves are thickest. Now we ought to get a heap of them when he returns. So the idea that Lincoln really studied this map, I think, makes it come alive, and we can use that to help our students see this is the information that was available as the president was making his decisions. So why would Lincoln study this map so much? What was so great about that map that Lincoln would have wanted to study it?
Again, it has that immense strategic value of having slave populations listed out, and you can tell where it's mostly concentrated and where it's lighter. Especially when you have like a cavalry raid that ends up going into a deeply enslaved territory,
Right.
where you're going to take away a lot of the enemy's economic assets.
Right. Yeah, so using it for that strategic purpose. What else?
I have a question.
Sure.
About the census. So the 1860 census, they list slaves by name and like as a person, or was it as a property? So it was just kind of.
They enumerated them by slaveholder, so they had a slave schedule that would list the number of slaves owned by different. Interestingly, a little bit of an aside, in 1850, the Census Bureau wanted to collect a lot of information about slaves. They wanted to know their names, children, relationships, how long they had lived in certain places, where they came from. How do you think the Southerners felt about that? You're making them human by doing that. Yeah, this might be too much information. Let's not do it. So imagine if we had that information. Imagine if we had the information from 1850 about the names, where they lived. No, these were numbers. They're still treating them as numbers, right? But
You make it all too human.
right,
It gives that extra moralistic punch.
right. So treating them as numbers. So Lincoln looked at this. For one thing, it has great symbolic power, right? It has visual appeal. You can look at that and go, oh, okay, I get a picture of what's going on, what the geography of slavery is, and perhaps what the challenge of emancipation is going to look like.
You talked about valleys where it was more concentrated, and I could see another strategic significance. Communication was difficult at that time, and you can kind of imagine if you were to free this isolated group of slaves that's surrounded by more freer counties,
Right.
that word might not even get out that this was happening. But on the other hand, if you were to win battles and free slaves at the beginning of a long river valley, you could imagine that word spreading to the south.
Along those networks
that could
of
affect morale.
Yeah.
And,
Right. So we've talked about how this might show concentrations of places where secessionist sentiment was particularly strong. We would assume, right, the slaveholders are the ones that are the strongest secessionists. What about the reverse of that? Look at Virginia. At this point in time, remember Virginia went all the way to the Ohio River. What do we know happened in 1863 to Virginia?
West Virginia split
West
off.
Virginia split off. You can look at that map and see West Virginia, right? That's lighter in color. Where else do you see large areas of light-colored counties?
Into Missouri.
Along across Missouri, the Ozarks. You can see the Appalachians right here. Were the people in Arkansas and Missouri all, gung-ho about slavery and quick to secede? No. In fact, Missouri didn't ultimately. Arkansas did. Arkansas only had, there were lots of sections of Arkansas didn't have, this is in the Ozarks. So you can see where the agricultural areas. Other flip side you might think about here then is, you can also see areas where there might be stronger unionist sentiment. Lincoln might study this map and go, oh, well, these could be the places in East Tennessee, East Tennessee, Western Virginia, where I might get more support for a unionist cause. Yes, sir.
But it could be misleading as well.
Absolutely.
Because
You misinterpret that.
if you knew about folks that volunteered, 101% of the population volunteered to serve. Where did 101%? Where did 1% come from? And that's kind of the universe of folks. In Texas, were for the Civil War.
And then you had the northern counties and the hill country where you had a large German population who were opposed to slavery and so forth. So, we could get into all kinds of, look at the historical details of the geography of these different places and try to understand the spectrum of Unionist to Confederate sentiment, not the either or. Yes.
Well, I was looking at the map. I remember the route of Sherman's march to the sea, and how it goes through a lot of pockets of slave populations in Georgia, and then moving in through South Carolina, North Carolina, and that adds in a little bit extra effect when we were talking about how one of us mentioned the whole line of communication and morale. Not only is Sherman burning down crops and disrupting railroad lines in those areas, he's burning down plantations. He's freeing large amounts of slaves. That drastically affects morale because main front line is in Virginia. And right behind them, Sherman is burning down plantations and freeing large amounts of slaves.
Right. So this map reinforces the conception that emancipation can be a valuable military tool, right? It also reinforces the idea that the nation is physically indivisible. So one of Lincoln's arguments was, where do you draw the line? How do you divide the country? There's no clear line right there that you would say, well, if we just draw a line here, those are all this place, this is all one side and that's all the other side. It's not that simple. Although our maps of the Confederacy and the Union make it look that way, this map gives us a much more nuanced perspective on the geography here. So this was, I mentioned earlier, the U.S. Coastal Survey created this map based on the data. And what the Coast Survey usually did, what their main task was to produce maps, as you might imagine, reconnaissance maps of the coasts. So they created reconnaissance maps of southern coasts to try to understand sort of the naval perspective on the war. And so the fact that they spent any time creating a map of the slave population also gives you a sense for the use of this for military strategy. So you can see it as important for military purposes. It also kind of reflects the belief that slavery is behind the rebellion. And we mentioned that when we talked about the order in which those states are enlisted, almost the order of secession. We can see it's not the whole South. So the idea is our rival, our enemy, is not completely united. There's places of strongholds. It's those South Carolinians again, those fire-eating, rabid, rabble-rousers. If we could only get some of the other people who are much more, conflicted about this whole thing on our side, we could win this war. So you get perhaps a sense of the strength of the effort toward rebellion. As I mentioned earlier too, minimalism is an important part of the beauty of this map. So lots of times before you might have had a lot of decoration. That minimalism lends it some sort of scientific credibility. You look at it and you go, okay, those are just the facts. You know? That's just, I'm not being sold anything. This is not a propaganda map. It's just intended to give it sort of scientific, minimalist, the facts only kind of perspective. The table we mentioned orders the states by dependence on slavery and also happens to correspond with state secession. The use of color is important too. Why use dark for the most entrenched areas of slavery? Yeah, right. But why use color like that? Why use a darker color and a lighter color?
Well, dark color, if you have more slaves, I mean, slaves are African American, so the darker the color, the more of them there are in that area.
Yeah. So you get a little bit of that sort of intersection of, okay, slave population equals a darker population. It's a standard principle in choropleth map making that darker colors represent higher densities and so forth. So part of the reason is just a plain German, effort to do things appropriately, statistically, and so forth. But there's also a little bit of a subtle message there too. Henry Clay, decades earlier, said slavery is the darkest spot in the map of our country. It's a stain on our country. It's a dark spot. This is the black. This is the evil. Yeah, this is this. Yeah. So that also works on that level as well. The title we mentioned ignores the fact of the Confederacy. This is the southern states of the United States. It's also an example of maps being used for fundraising. So the fact that they sold it for the benefit of sick and wounded soldiers of the U.S. Army is an example of early fundraising tactics. All right, so let's get to our next big question. What if Abraham Lincoln had a G.I.S? What if he could have done more with the data than just that printed map that he studied? So at this point, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Charlie Travis. I guess before I do that, questions? Lingering questions?
Yep.
Sir.
Where can we get them?
Great. So we will share the PowerPoint and link. I've actually got a high-resolution version of that map posted in a shared drive, and so we'll get that sent out to everybody who's here by email. So as long as we have your email address on the registration, we'll send you a link that will give you access to all our stuff. Sound good? Okay. Dr. Travis.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I threw out my back a week ago, so if I just stand here, I can hobble over to the map so you'll understand. So I apologize for that. My name is Dr. Charles Travis, and like Andy, I'm a historical cultural geographer, but I also teach geographical information systems here. And what this image is on my left, far left, is a kernel density mapping of the 1860 map. So in a way it does the same thing, but it visualizes it in a different way, in a way that's sort of 3D. When we think about reading maps, one of the things that you have to take in mind is that when you flatten a topography into a flat surface, it puts a bit of a learning curve on the reader. Through evolution and years, we are used to seeing things in 3D. And so when we have to convert spatial or geographic phenomena and perceptions into 2D, there is a bit of a learning curve. And a map is just like any other text. It has an author. Because of the patina of scientific framing, it tends to lead people to think that what's on the map is scientifically objective. But that's not necessarily true. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you what a GIS is, and then I'm going to demonstrate some open source and proprietary software manipulations of the data from that map and from the U.S. Census from 1790, 1820, and 1860, which also show the diffusion of slavery over those years. So how many people here have used a GPS in their car? So I've got some geospatial people here. How many people have used Google Maps? So you have been engaging in geospatial technology because it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And what I'm going to go through today are open source platforms and then some proprietary platforms, and show you some tricks of the trade, as it were. And as Andy said, we're going to be having it's a Dropbox.
Yes.
What I'll do is I'll assemble some links to free tutorials for QGIS, and some other information so you can start using these tools yourself. Basically what a GIS is, you can see I have gray hair and I've got a crick in my back, so I'm in my 50s, and that's par for the course. But when I was in high school and college, teachers and professors still use acetates. You know what I mean by acetates and overhead projectors? Well, if you can imagine what a GIS is a series of acetates that contain geographic information, and they're laid on top of each other. So this image in the middle represents sort of a phenomenon of what a GIS is. It takes different layers and layers of like a deck of cards, and each layer is attached to a database. So in a sense, GIS can be seen as a database visualizer. It does other things as well, but for our purposes today, we're going to think about GIS as a database visualizer. So we're going to go through this suite except for QGIS. QGIS approximates what ArcGIS does, except it's free. ArcGIS is very expensive. It's almost ubiquitous. It's got 40% of the global market share. But with the digital revolution of the 21st century, more open source and free softwares are coming on stream that you can use without having to try to get a very expensive license first. Technology, I tell you. They tell actors, never go on stage with a baby or a kid, or GIS for that matter. Okay, so what I did to prepare for this, I want to show you a simple exercise that you can do pretty easily. What I did is I made a Excel spreadsheet of the legend that was included in this map. I wanted to see how I could visualize this. So I saved this, I basically copied that data into a spreadsheet, and then I was able to upload it to Google Maps. And it's a pretty, well, I don't want to say it's simple, but I think I'll, so simply you go into your browser and you open up your Google Maps, and this is sort of where I live. So if you have Google Maps on your phone, or you use Google and you've enabled it to locate you, it will sort of open up on where you're living. And so there's a function here where you can make different maps. And so if you click on the three bars on the left, there's a menu, and in the menu there's a link called Your Places. And what this does is basically track you if you geospatially enabled your phone. So some people like that, some people don't. Some people don't like to know where. So if you don't want this to happen, don't geospatially enable your phone or your computer. You can still use Google Maps without it. And so you click on, you go into this, and there's different menu items, and the ones you would want to click on are map. At the very bottom, there's a create map link. And it'll open up into a blank map like this. Now, there used to be a platform called Google Fusion, where you could take that spreadsheet that I just showed you, you pop it into a Google map, and it would visualize a map for you. They're decommissioning that this year. But you can basically do the same thing in Google Maps. So, I've got this Google map, and I want to import that database I made. So I'm going to click import, and you can drag all different types of geospatial formats in here. We're just going to talk about the Excel. I converted my Excel spreadsheet into a CSV file. I always say that backwards to my students. I always say CVS because of pharmacy. But it's CSV, and you simply upload it. So here, this is a CVS right here. That's the Excel version of it. So I'm going to click on this, and it will upload. And then I have to choose columns for my place marks. So what I'm going to do is put, and this is all the data that was in the little spreadsheet. I guess I never knew how to stay with. No, what I'll do is I'll show you the finished map because it might be a firewall again. Okay, so here's the finished map after I've uploaded it. So when you upload it, depending if you have a firewall or not, it's going to ask you for latitude and longitude. And with Google Maps, you don't need to put in latitude and longitude. All you have to do is put in a place name. And so the place name that I put in were the states. So, so as you see here, each of these markers marks a different state. Maryland, and it gives the data that was on that little spreadsheet I showed you. So go down to Tennessee, go to Arkansas, go to Texas, and what it's locating is the centroid. So it's a simple enough visualization. Google Fusion used to do that, but they're winding it down. So the same thing, you can use this. So Google Maps is a good place to start. And I use Google Maps to map out things, and I'm going to use proprietary G.I.S. So we'll go on to the ArcGIS Online. How many people have played around with the ArcGIS Online platform? When it came out, it was initially free, and they got a lot of people to use it, and then they made it proprietary. So you can get a basic ArcGIS Online account, which does basic things. But if you want to do more complex things, now you have to pay. And the license is about $500 a year to do it. But you can do a lot of stuff, especially if you don't want to use the desktop version. So this is that same data sheet loaded up into the ArcGIS Online. And here is the same data, except that I'm signifying it by the size of the slave populations. So as you can see, the larger circles represent larger slave populations. And there's other ways you can manipulate this type of data as well. There's different ways of drawing it. So if I want to add percentage of slaves versus the free population, I just click on the add attribute, and then I can choose my drawing style. Color and size, you can make it smaller, you can make it bigger. There's different ways to manipulate this data. So I'm just going to pick this one, and you click done, and then I'm going to show you the legend, and there's the legend. And so what it's showing is percentage of slaves compared to the free population. And there's a number of things you can do with this. And that's pretty much plug and play. And the same thing works. You do not need to know latitude and longitude to upload this data. You just need to have a place name in your spreadsheet. And ArcMap is pretty, it's a pretty good platform to get your feet wet in, because they'll sign up for an Esri account, and I'll give you information in the box on how to do that. And when you sign up, it will take you step by step through the process of making a map. It doesn't leave you to your own devices. It's pretty easy to create sort of simple maps out of spreadsheets that you created yourself. And it's a good tool to use with your students as well, because the tutorials are built into this, and you can teach a class on how to make a map like this pretty simply by creating your own little spreadsheet and having the students upload it and follow the directions in ArcGIS Online, and they can make little maps like that. So that's sort of the open source approach. When I was asked to do this, it reminded me when I was a postdoc at Trinity, I was approached by a professor of Irish history who wanted me to make maps for her book. Her book concerned making Ireland English in the 17th century. I didn't know anything about the 17th century. And I really didn't want to, I liked the challenge of trying to make the maps for her, but I didn't know anything about the period. And I know a little bit more about the Civil War, being born in America and taking American history courses and reading about it, but really not much more than that. I'm not an expert. So when I was thinking about bringing up a presentation for you, I had to think sort of like a GIS. And so I found out that there's a source out there by IMPUMS, which is the National Historical GIS database. And they have census data from 1790 to 2017 by decade. And they have a whole lot of information. And so I started playing around. I went in and wanted to see what kind of data I could do with it. And so this is sort of the desktop version. It's like the difference between driving a car with automatic transmission and a car that's got manual transmission. So the two platforms I showed you before, the Google Earth and the ArcGIS Online, that's sort of like driving a car with an automatic transmission. Using this data is using ArcGIS software, which is sort of like driving a car with a manual transmission. However, there's a platform at the end that I'll show you that you can get data out of this, which is much more sophisticated than the simple spreadsheet I just put up. So my initial mapping showed, I went in and I pulled data from 1790, 1820, and 1860 on slave populations. And the thing about the way the data was formatted differently for each time period. So there wasn't a standard format that they began with in 1790 that they're still using today, 2017. It probably changed every time they did a survey. As the country was growing, the way that they collected data, enumerated people, changed, and the way that they formatted that data changed as well. So initially I made the 1860 mapping, and there was a bit of database parsing I had to do, where you probably have to take a GIS class to be able to do it, to be honest. So I created that map, and then I thought, well, I'll go back to the beginning, 1790, and I looked at the data. The data was in a completely different format, so I had to play around with it so I could show slave populations in the same for 1820. But you'd see the evolution of slavery between 1790 and 1860. And if I were to do a big project on this with Dr. Milson and other people in our department, what I would do is, and making a GIS is 70% database work, is collect data from all the years between 1790 and 1870, every 10 years, and then format a master database so I could go through it. Now, I want to show you sort of a behind-the-scenes view of ArcGIS. And this is sort of the way the platform works. Okay, so this, what you see here is that map from 1860. But connected to this, what we call a shapefile, is an attribute table. And it's this attribute table that contains the data way at the end that it's being visualized. So what you see here are different categories. And the first time I downloaded the data, I thought, yeah, they'll download everything from 1860, type of crops, size of the land holding, number of slaveholders and everything. And I got this huge, huge database. And then half the data that you wanted to visualize had to be sort of prepped in GIS to do that. So I decided to make it very simple for my other maps for this presentation. But the point I'm trying to make is that these columns all represent data that can be mapped. And they can be mapped in juxtaposition to each other, or you can combine them. And you can get pretty complex and create pretty complex maps. And if Lincoln had had a GIS, he would have been able to manipulate the different types of information against each other, probably maybe to get a more accurate picture of what he was trying to do. So this is simply just one map, and there's other ways that this could be represented as well. So here's another way to represent the same data from the 1860 map as far as slave totals. So you get a completely different pattern and visualization using this type of visualization, which represents slave totals by percentage around it. And you see the sort of a pattern emerging in the same places it's probably shown in the 1860 map. But because it's clustered there, you can tie crop data, you can tie data from the natural landscape, physical geography. You can layer the map so it's a very rich representation of the place. And that's the idea behind GIS, is these separate layers. So, it's going to get dark again, and then come light again. And the ArcGIS suite that they've had for the past 15 years is sort of an expensive software, but it's used everywhere. It's used in academia, it's used by the government, it's used by businesses. But the company Esri that's making it is transitioning into a new phase, and I'll talk about that in a second. A part of the ArcGIS suite is this program called ArcScene, which you can do 3D statistical visualizations of this data. So what this map here represents is the same thing that 1860 map represented. The areas where there's the highest density percentage of slave populations. But it gives you a 3D view of it, which is naturally easier for the human eye to track than trying to parse a two-dimensional map. It doesn't take that much work even to get a gut instinct to say that the higher extrusions there are probably representing areas that have a more of a dense slave population. And that's the same thing behind this kernel density mapping. It's something that your mind registers right away. Whereas if you were looking at that flat map, you probably register there were darker areas and lighter areas as well. And it's just a different sort of way of visualizing geostatistical data. Now what ArcGIS is doing is they're coming out with this new online platform called ArcPro. And I think ArcPro probably in 5 years, even though they, as he says, they're not going to get rid of ArcGIS desktop because everybody uses it, will probably take over. With ArcPro, you can do 2D and 3D representations in the same window. You can manipulate data in different ways. It's an online stream that they're starting to promote very slowly now. Because most of us GISers, especially old people like me, have been using the desktop version for the past, well, I've been teaching GIS about 20 years, for 20 years. So they're transitioning into this new platform where you can do 2D, 3D. The interface is more like a video game than, say, a database visualizer like ArcGIS. And it's going to probably be the way of the future. But they're not phasing the desktop out. But for the past couple of platforms I talked about, the process of getting data into it is downloading it from that site that I told you, opening the geodatabases, and then seeing how they represent the data and formatting the data, and then doing some geometric calculations. It's a bit complex if you haven't had a GIS class. So what I want to leave you with are two things that you can do right away. The first is Social Explorer. Social Explorer is the proprietary software that comes with that IMPUS GIS database. Now it costs about $100 a month to use. As you can see, I'm using a free trial for this because I'm trialing it. But it's got a great little platform, and what I did is I went in and I pulled down data from the 1860 census. And I did a couple of things, but I want to take you through the suite. As you can see here, this is data that was pulled down from the same databases that I did for ArcGIS, except I did this with Social Explorer. It allows you to go in and sort of pick your way through this. And so what I was interested in was comparing the data that was in this census database, which has been assembled over the past 15 years, and the data that was represented in the map to see if the state population figures were the same. So what you're seeing here in these star circles is the data that I visualized in Google Maps, is the legend of the actual 1860 map. And what the darker areas are the areas where slavery was. So if I click on Alabama, the slave population from the 1860 paper map that Andy talked about is about 435,132. And if you click on the Social Explorer from this database, there's a, you're not seeing what I'm seeing. I apologize. My bad. Here we go. I'll rewind. My apologies. Here we go. Everybody see that? My apologies. So it comes with this interface. And when you click there, it'll come up with a blank map. And then there'll be a change data button there. And you click on that, and it just has a menu where you can go and pick out whatever type data you want from any census that you have. And you just pull it into the map. It's like online shopping. How many people have shopped for something online? Oh, come on. Come on. And it's the same sort of principle. And they're being very clever in how they pull this out because, you know, the online platforms initially were used to serve the market. You know, every corporation, Walmart to Target to these food shops now, you can shop online. And they use the same logic behind this. So you can go in and you can shop for data and pick what you want, and it will load it up into the map. And so, just to reiterate what I was interested in doing, and it'll allow you to load your own data as well. So I went in and shopped for data from the 1860 census, slave populations per state. I put that into the map, and then I uploaded the spreadsheet that I made from the 1860 map, the one that I showed you in Google Maps. And these stars are Google Map data. So in Virginia, the slave population is 4,098.87, but you click on, you get and there's small discrepancies. And I want to see what the biggest discrepancy is. Missouri, it was 114,000, and so 114,931, 114,965, and there are these small discrepancies between what's in the actual census and what was put into. So in Texas, there's a difference. It's 180,682, and from the actual population, it's 182,566. And so for me, it was interesting. It provoked an interesting question for me. First of all, where did the people that made the 1860 map, where did they get their data from? And that posed one question. So as a researcher, that's what I want to explore. The other question is to figure out how the guys that put this database together, how they compiled it. Now, they say they got it from the U.S. Census. So there's little discrepancies there. And even though they might seem like, you know, a difference in 2,000, 3,000, 1,000 is not a lot, it is a slippage. And it makes me sort of curious. And so that's what heightened my curiosity. But this is pretty easy to use, and like ArcGIS, it has a little tour. You sign up for it. It tells you, hey, do you want to make a map? You click on that, and it will lead you through a tour of the different things you can do. You can create an actual slideshow presentation or a little bit of a movie. Aside from the $100 a month, I think it's if you're using this in the U.S. history class and you're interested in demographic data, this is a pretty good tool to use. I think it'd be well worth the expenditure. I think you can get a lot out of it. And as far as census data goes, I would choose using this over, say, ArcGIS Online. So I apologize for the sort of rambling presentation as it's in my back went out a little bit schematical, but I want to leave you with one thing, which is sort of a shameless plug on my part. But will allow you to have a tutorial on how to use database visualization in ArcGIS Online. It's this Tell the Story of Irish Public History. And this is a Learn ArcGIS lesson that I wrote with a student of mine from Trinity. And what it does is it visualizes the deaths that occurred in Dublin during the Easter Rising in 1916. And a lot of this data was taken from Glasnevin Cemetery. And what it is a, let's see if I can just pull up the actual page. slowly. Anyway, apologize for that. Okay, so I'll leave you with this address, and what it is, it's a lesson that will take you through uploading a database that's there into ArcGIS Online, and then there's a second lesson where you can create what's called a story map. And the lesson has all the data that you will need, but it will take you through on how to create one of these online maps. And those skills are transferable to other things. So what I tell my students is, do one of these lessons and see how the person formatted the database. And, you know, and because you can do the same thing for your own data, for your own teaching needs. So if I had had more time, perhaps we could have created a larger database of the 1860s census with the different variables and popped it up in ArcGIS Online in a bit more of a complex way. But if you just click Start Lesson, we'll send you the link. It will take you through the ArcGIS Online suite, both the basic ArcGIS Online and the Story Maps function, so you can create a map. And typically by doing a lesson like that, you get an idea of how to create a map for your own subject. And there's a caveat there. Whenever you're working with technology, as you can tell from today's presentation, there's going to be glitches. And what I tell my students when they take a G.I.S. class is this is something you're just going to have to get used to. There's going to be glitches. It's not always going to work the way that you want it to work. But if you stick with it and you're persistent, you can mine some diamonds, geospatial diamonds. So what I just would suggest, if you're really interested in bringing geospatial technology into your class, is looking at Social Explorer. Do the free trial version and see if you like it. If you do like it, maybe you can go to your administrators and get them to pay for it. Or do this lesson, Tell the Story of Irish Public History, which will take you through the online ArcGIS, how to upload data, how to upload images, how to create map stories. And it's a good lesson plan to get your feet wet and learning basic GIS, which is a little bit more sophisticated than Google Maps, and will get you into the gateway of perhaps using proprietary GIS. So again, apologize, I'm an old man with a bad back. That's the end of my presentation for now, and I'll take any questions you may have.
How do you create a CSV file?
When you save an Excel document, it gives you different options of what format you want to save it in, save as, and you just scroll down to the CSV. So how many people have used story maps or anything in your classroom? You have. Brave new world out there. So what I would start with is probably something like this or something like Social Explorer. We'll give you the links. And with this digital generation, the millennial digital generation, you'll find that some students will take to it like a duck to water. So in my world geography class, I give them the option of delivering a PowerPoint presentation or a story map presentation. And I'm finding that the students are starting to do these story maps, which is an online platform. And they seem pretty adept at it. So I'm not, initially I was a little bit nervous about that. In the classroom, you know how things can go wrong with technology. But I saw some students create some really good story map presentations. And they seemed like it wasn't any big deal, because they've all been raised in this digital environment with phones and everything. So I guess it's a matter of encouraging them through online lessons like this that are free, which is great, and platforms like Social Explorer. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming along.